thoughtful ideas and suggestions for guests and topics.
Great events, programs, and student activities.
All the factors and research.
Welcome to this week's segment of Dialogue Houston. I'm your host, Lawrence Payne. To our regular viewing audience, welcome. To those joining us perhaps for the first time here for ACC's TV Dialogue Houston, we're here now every Tuesday and Thursday at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., Saturday afternoons at 3 p.m. As always, at the top of the hour, let me thank you for your thoughtful calls, emails, and text messages concerning previous shows we've aired, but particularly in this wonderful format of doing the show Zoom from home, your great thoughts and ideas for guests and topics and subjects to be covered on future segments of Dialogue Houston, because after all, this is your community affairs, public affairs show here on ACC TV, now proudly in its 27th year. We can also be found now on YouTube and on line, so you can pull up the shows anytime you want from ACC's TV. We have a great show planned for you today. It is that time of year that something magically happens. Every year in Houston around April, usually get him on usually in May. This is the 39th year of the Houston Annual Area Survey, conducted by our great friend, Dr. Stephen L. Klineberg, professor of sociology, Rice University, Kinder Institute, who have been doing this survey and giving us as a city, a large major metropolitan city in the United States, the only ongoing longitudinal study year after year about how Houstonians think, feel, act, and more likely will respond to a myriad of issues. Dr. Klineberg also has his book coming out very shortly, next Tuesday, in fact. The book is called Houston on the Cusp of a Changing America, Prophetic City. I've been teasing Dr. Klineberg about this book. We have a phrase we've been using with him. He's been with book. With book for long. The book is now about to be born and birthed. So without further ado, let me introduce actually my first guest on Dialogue Houston when we started the show was Dr. Klineberg. So Dr. Klineberg, welcome.
Larry, thank you so much. Always great to be with you, of course.
Great to have you here.
It's been a while.
Who knew? Who knew? This would be 39 years of doing the survey now.
It only took me 39 years to write this book.
Only 39. But you know, every time I read the new survey, when you go back to 1982, the first year, the similarities are interesting to see how we've come and grown, how we've changed in attitudes and some perspectives, and how some things come back again in a circular kind of format. Particularly this survey that was done before the COVID-19. Tell us where you see us going now, and we'll talk about that in a little detail. What's the highlights of this survey?
You bet. Well, the interviews for this year's survey were done in January through February to March 12th was the last interview. And of course, March 16th is when, for the first time, the bars and restaurants were closed, and we went into this tremendous challenge that we're facing now with a triple whammy, a health pandemic, economic shutdown that is the highest amount of unemployment since the Great Depression, and a collapse of oil prices. And those three forces are really going to have major impact on how we emerge out of this and the kind of city that we're building. And so we have this survey that is just before we entered into this. Then we'll come back, of course, in January and February of 2021 to see how we've been changed. What has this done? But the survey at this point is an extraordinarily positive picture of who we are as a civilization, as a city, as a population, and increasing comfort with diversity, increasing a sense of community solidarity in Houston. That is really very interesting to see. Just finish that. Just one quick example of that is the classic question about social trust. Question that says, do you think most people can be trusted, or you can't be too careful in dealing with people? And the percent saying in Houston, most people can be trusted, went from 31% to 35 to 37 to 40 to 42% in the survey this year. Consistent, significantly increasing sense of solidarity with each other, of support for the diversity that is Houston, that is a real source of strength, I think, as we go into the very difficult period and the real challenges that lie ahead.
Houston has been hit in a threefold manner. Tell us about that. There are three interesting things that are impacting us all at the same time here in Houston.
Well, here we are with massive health pandemic, not as serious in Houston as in many other parts of the country, but increasingly serious and challenging to the health support systems of the city, plus the worst regional recession about to hitting now, the unemployment rates that are as high as they were during the Great Depression, that is happening simultaneously, and then especially for Houston, the collapse of oil prices. So it's those three things together that will make the next 8 to 12 months a really challenging time for the city.
So that power of solidarity, the feeling of trust and how we unite is going to be so important as we go forward to figure out what those next steps are they not?
Exactly right. And we're all in this together, and wearing masks has something to do with our sense of responsibility for each other. And how that will proceed and how strong it will be as we deal with the very tough issues that await us will be very interesting to watch.
You as a sociologist have really talked about over the years the inequities that have existed before the pandemic, before COVID-19, but now the veil has been lifted off of most inequities going forward. How are we going to navigate those things at the same time trying to bring back the economy?
Yeah, that's one of the things that the health, I never know what to call it, the health pandemic has done is to lay bare the terrible inequalities. We've been watching that in Houston. One of the questions we asked last year that said, supposing you had an emergency expense and had to come up with $400, how would you deal with that situation? Would you be able to pay for it out of savings? Would you need to borrow it? Or would you not be able to come up with $400 to meet an emergency expense? And 39% of Harris County residents said they could not come up with $400. Living that close to the edge, that close to bankruptcy, and tied into 38% or 37% said they had difficulty paying for the groceries to feed their families during the past year. And all that was before this collapse of the economy. And of course, it's massively tied into being African American or Latino and being a Latino immigrant or US born Latino, that this diversity that we have in the city that can be the greatest strength that Houston could have as it positions itself in the global economy could also end up tearing us apart and becoming a major liability. Much depends on how we collectively address these issues. But the inequalities that we've been watching grow in Houston, tied in above all else to access to quality education, is the critical reality of our times. And it's going to be interesting to see how we deal with that as the months proceed.
Let's talk a moment about the education crisis. There was already an imbalance in education system here in the greater Houston area, depending on which zip code you lived in, whether you received a great education or not. Going forward with the need for laptops with access to computers, with access to connectivity, and all those things we're going to have, we don't have it now. We're talking about doing a bond election to pass money to be able to get computers for everyone. What is laid bare also with COVID-19 is the great disparity in able to access the new online learning platforms that are going to be a necessity going forward.
That's the question, right? And we're also, the city is facing growing expenses and shrinking revenues. So it's going to be that's what's so fascinating about this city. At the same time, when you ask people in the privacy of their homes, how do you see these issues? You get increasingly positive, progressive views. So for example, a question that we've been asking over the years, it said, which of these things come closest to your feelings about the public schools in Houston? The schools have enough money, if it was used wisely, to provide a quality education, where the schools will need significantly more money to provide a quality education. When we first asked that question in the 1990s, the vast majority, 58 to 35%, said the schools have all the money they need, they're wasting it. Right? And if it was used wisely, we don't need to raise. And then during the first decade of the 21st century, it was a 50-50 split. We came back 2 years ago and then checked it again this year, significant shift to 55% saying the schools will need significantly more money to provide a quality education, and only 37% saying the schools have all the money they need. That sea change and understanding of how critical education is and how we now need to spend more money to address those issues is real and solid. And there, the other piece was also, it was a great question about, are you in favor or opposed to increasing local taxes in order to provide universal preschool education for every child in Houston? We talked about that for many years. It's the biggest return on investment you can get. One of the great moments of truth in American education is third grade reading. If you're not reading at third grade level in third grade, you are 4 times more likely to drop out of high school. And the single most powerful predictor whether you can read at third grade level is, did you start kindergarten ready to learn to read? And rich kids in Houston start kindergarten 1.5 to 2 years ahead of poor kids. And 70% in the survey this year said they were in favor of increasing local taxes to provide universal preschool education. So the public is coming to understand this. They're prepared to support it, at least verbally. Will we really make those investments in a way that makes a difference at a time of truly major challenge for the city across the board is going to be one of the questions that we will be asked the future generations will ask of us. How did we respond, knowing how critical education is? Did we make the investments that we knew needed to be made, even during this time of economic difficulty?
Steve, I feel that to pass this next bond election, we're going to need your help. Because as you just said, it's going to be how it is framed and reframed, what's the context we put it in, and how important it is going forward. Jacob Carpenter, the educational writer for the Chronicle, when he first posed the RHISD for the computers, et cetera, said that this is going to run into all kinds of obstacles. Well, if you start posing it that way and putting it out there as a negative rather than a positive, then you're going to have problems going forward. This should be not optional for Houston to have a future going forward to do the things we need to do to educate these young people. That statistic that you always talk about demographically, of those under the age of 20
Yes.
today, more than 70% are Hispanic and African-American students. If we don't educate these students, we don't have a future. The argument going forward is, what's the argument, people? Back to your case of solidarity. If we say we're in this together as a community and we all care equally about human beings equally being treated right and being able to get a quality education, what's the discussion?
Yeah, beautiful. I mean, 70% of everybody under 20 who would be the workers and citizens and voters and taxpayers of Houston in the 21st century, more than 70% are African American, Latino. The two groups overwhelmingly most likely to be living in poverty. We know what poverty does to your ability to succeed in the public school system. I tell anyone who will listen, it's a safe statement to make that if Houston's African American and Latino young people are unprepared to succeed in the global knowledge economy of the 21st century, it is difficult, if not impossible, to envision a prosperous future for Houston. The story of Houston and the story of America is the aging of Anglos. So it's not until you reach people age 63 and older in Harris County that the majority of folks are still Anglos. At each younger age group, the percentage of Anglos plummets, the percentage of African Americans, Latinos, and of Asians, and above all Latinos surges. That's the future. That's who we are. That's the tremendous asset that Houston can have as it positions itself in the global economy, building the connections to the global marketplace, or this diversity can tear us apart. Much depends on how this generation speaks to these remarkable issues, the two fundamental changes of our time. The new economy where education has become critical, the good blue-collar jobs have disappeared, and the demographic revolution. Nowhere more clearly seen than in Houston. This is where the American future is going to be worked out.
A good place to take a small pause. We'll come back right after we do so with Dr. Klineberg. And we're going to dive into his book, and we're going to dive into contemporary issues going forward that's happening all around us in the news as we speak, and we'll be right back. with us for the first part of the show. We have a great conversation with our good friend, Dr. Stephen L. Klineberg, Rice University, Kinder Institute, sociologist, professor, and now author. The book is here. The book we've been waiting for. Steve, this coming Tuesday, June 2nd, it is going to be released to the public. Tell us about that.
So the book is called Prophetic City, Houston on the Cusp of a Changing America. Ties in very much to what we've just been talking about. You can see the American future happening here in Houston earlier than almost anywhere else. This is where you can see the American future emerging, and what makes Houston, I think, one of the most consequential and important cities in America, because this is where all of America will look like Houston looks today in terms of its demographics. By 2045 to 2050, we are there first. And how we navigate this transition and address these issues will have enormous implications for the American future as well as the Houston future. So the book looks at the sort of national implications of these 38 years, it was, of systematic surveys in this city. And the last serious book about Houston, the last comprehensive analysis of the city, was published in 1991. So it's been over 30 years before it's been a comprehensive analysis of the fourth largest city in America. So part of the goal of this book is to reclaim Houston's Houston's right to the national attention that this city deserves. Most people have no concept of what's happening in Houston. So my hope is that this will help to clarify that, but above all, to help clarify how are we as Americans dealing with these remarkable new changes that have redefined the 21st century for all of us.
The book comes out in an interesting time, to say the least, setting aside COVID-19 only for the moment. What's happening in Minnesota right now as we speak, as we're doing this show, what happened earlier at Central Park with Amy Cooper and Margaret Cooper, and speaks very clearly to we're a divided country, that we need solidarity, that all human beings are equal, and that's most importantly, it speaks to our common humanity that the book will speak to, that is not an option that we have to have, we must have going forward as a nation. So Steve, where does the dialogues that we need to have and the critical conversations going forward after this day, this week, is going to be entirely different than they've been, because now you see people outraged who were not outraged. I think Mr. Floyd's death, George Floyd's death, is outraging a whole new segment of our society that have been sitting by the way. Now we all have to get in the fray.
Yeah, I mean, we've been there before. We've had episodes like this before, and we're going to have some again. It's reflection of there's a new kind of empowerment of racism in America, where people who have been on the margins are now increasingly feeling empowered to act on it. I guess the most important thing that I keep coming back to is in the surveys that we've been conducting, there's room for tremendous optimism. You ask people in the privacy of their homes, how do you see the world? And you see Houstonians and Americans in general increasingly embracing the diversity, increasingly falling in love with each other. We are watching an epidemic of multiracial babies being born in this country. We are recognizing all the cities that have been at the forefront of the ethnic transformations are embracing those changes. So it's important, I think, to make a distinction between what makes headlines and what grabs our attention and what is devastating and terrible, but not lose sight of the fact that we Americans as a group are moving in the right direction. And it's difficult to hold both of those views simultaneously. But it's hard not to be optimistic when you look at how ordinary Americans in the privacy of their homes are addressing these issues. And the fact that you get these individual episodes that are just horrific and reminders of how far we still have to go, how much the racism of our past remains in the present, should not blind us from recognizing that there's also an underlying positive movement that's happening across the country.
You and I have talked about this over the last few years. I think it's going to take a larger conversation and dialogue and discussion that poses the question in a way that has not been posed before. And that is to ask the question, what is the fair and ethical treatment of all human beings? All human beings' lives matter. All human beings are equal.
Right.
We haven't had that conversation. We have not been willing to have that conversation. And until we do, speaking as an African-American male, and you said things like this have happened in the past and will happen again. I knew what you meant in the larger context. For me, though, this thought being drawn in the sand, the line in the sand. This is it. If another African-American male loses his life at the hands of a police officer in the way that we saw George Floyd's life being taken, being murdered, being killed, then we all as a country have to realize we cannot do this anymore going forward. This goes back to slavery and post-slavery days and the lack of African-American males being seen as human beings, as total, fully human beings. And so the question I think that you have always been so good as a sociologist is trying to help people understand how this interdependency, interrelatedness, interconnectedness has to work. It's not optional going forward. And the pandemic has shown that. It doesn't care who you are, what color, what race, how much money you make, it's gonna kill everybody equally. And as you said earlier, not wearing a mask, you don't wear a mask for you, you wear your mask for others. And so because you care about the humanity of the other, of the human beingness in the other. And so somewhere along the line, this stuff has got to change. And I've been talking to readers in the last week. They're saying, yeah, too bad the churches are closed now. I would give this great homily and sermon if everybody was there. Well, do it online. That's just another cop-out. Okay, I'm sorry. Go talk to me, Steve. He and I have been doing this for 26 years, so go.
Yeah, and you know, these are profound changes in America, and I guess it's not surprising that you know, in our surveys we find that the single most powerful predictor among Anglos of all of our measures of comfort with diversity and support for immigration, the single most powerful predictor is age. Younger Anglos take for granted what we older Anglos are struggling to accept. We have been we older Anglos who grew up in the 60s and 70s, that was a different world than the world of the 1990s and 2000s. And so the surveys show this remarkable phenomenon of you know, one of the classic insights of psychology is that the comfort that people feel, that the principle is what I am familiar with feels right and natural. What I'm unfamiliar with feels unnatural and somehow not quite right. Younger Anglos are growing up in a world where they take this diversity and the challenges and the realities of building this new America in a much more powerful way than us older Anglos who are still struggling to accept these changes. So there's room here for recognizing that these are part of the terrible challenge of dealing with a revolutionary set of changes that are going on. But at the same time, recognizing that what's called the psychology of inevitability, as you were saying, Larry, there's no choice here. You can't stop that. You can't not come to grips with these new, you can't not want to work to make this multi-ethnic world work, because that's the only world we're going to know.
I lived and worked in the Twin Cities area, Minneapolis, St. Paul, for the Archdiocese of Minneapolis, St. Paul for 4 years. And so I'm very familiar with that area. I've gotten a bunch of phone calls still from friends in the last few days. The demographic makeup of the people who are both demonstrating during the day, which is a very mixed, diverse crowd of all races and ethnicity. The rioters are the demonstrators at night. The overwhelming population are young, white males. And so you have this kind of solidarity in a kind of a strange way, because Minnesota, for all of its pluses and minuses, is a very, in some ways, liberal community.
Yeah, right.
You have people joining in. Now, whether they're joining in for the right reasons or not is always another question. But you have this young white male population there side by side, if one would call it that, in solidarity with their brothers, African Americans. Right. We'll have to see how that plays out.
So that's a basis for some optimism also. And it's a slow process. Social change is uneven and difficult. Someone said that there's no change that doesn't entail a loss, right? So people are dealing with nostalgia for our imaginary time in the past, whatever it was. But we're moving in the right direction.
Let's talk about movement here in Houston. Tell us
Okay.
where we can get the survey so we can educate ourselves on the new 39th annual survey. Tell us where we can go to be part of your wonderful book launch.
Yes.
So tell us, give us information about both of those.
Okay, so the Kinder Institute is hosting the official release of the book on June 3rd, noon on Wednesday, the 3rd of June. And the way to get to it is just kinder.rice.edu/events. And the first one that appears will be this one. Come and join us. I'm going to be in conversation with Bill Fulton talking about the book and why we're very pleased that finally it is coming out and we hope will be of some real value.
All right, and we can find the survey where?
Also, kinder.rice.edu, and it'll be right there.
There's another opportunity to engage with Steve. The Center for Houston's Future
Yes.
is also doing a leadership webcast on June 11th. And Lisa Falkenberg, our wonderful editor of the opinion page at the Houston Chronicle, will be the interviewer. You can get to that by just going to the Center for Houston's Future website and register. That is June 11th on Thursday at 5:45. So we get to see you twice.
You can buy the book.
I was waiting for you to say that.
At Amazon or at Brazos Bookstore.
Brazos Bookstore. I know, good old Brazos Bookstore. Yes, so visit that, please go down there. And we're also going to feature Steve in an extended version of some point of either Dialogue Houston or some other opportunity we'll create because we want to do something through our author series at the Houston Public Library. We'll probably do it on our own Zoom thing from HPL and make that happen a little future down the road. But Steve, I want to thank you. We're out of time as usual. It goes too quickly.
Wow.
And we want to thank you for being part of Dialogue Houston. We look forward to the book launch. I look forward to reading it and being part of the dialogue. We're going to probably form a little book club discussion after the book comes out with our friends.
I should say quickly, Larry's an important part of that book. You have some wonderful insights as we put.
It's going to be a fun discussion to have. I think it's also very timely. See, we teased about when it's coming out, what point in time in history. I always think things happen for a reason at the time they're supposed to happen. And maybe this is the right time, given all that's happening in society and the country around us, to have this discussion about our common humanity to and for each other. So let me just close with this closing thought. As we continue to discern together what the next new normal will be, let's show everyone a little COVID-19 love. Wear your face mask, wash your hands, keep your distance, and remember, I wear my mask not for me, but for my neighbor, for others. Until we see you and we come together again for Dialogue Houston, until then as always, be safe, be well, peace, power, and love.